Hi, and welcome to the fourth edition of Change from the Centre. For today, I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the Rachel Reeves fallout from the budget. I know I talked about the budget last week, but the clamour has started it's probably just about over, to be fair, for Rachel Reeves to stand down. But before I move on to why I think she should stay, I thought I'd just let you know what's coming up in the next few episodes. So, next episode I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Really, I'm going to answer some questions that people have put to me about why I believe what I do, and some personal, some other stuff as well. Just general response to questions, and you can see I've been listening because I've been persuaded to blur my background because apparently it was a bit too adventurous for some people. But also, I'll talk about how I think people can make a difference. And some of it is about trying to break away from party allegiances, really, so that people can think more about fixing a broken system rather than getting a party in and into power who are going to be victims of that broken system as soon as they get into power. And I'll talk about that a bit more with this Rachel Reeves thing. So that's what's coming up in the next episode. And then following on from that, it depends what's going on politically. If there's something interesting going on, I'll talk about what's current. But otherwise, I'm going to talk about, I think, either looked after children and how we need to change the way we manage and deal with our children in care, and why we desperately need change in that area, because it's probably the thing that I care most about out of all of these things. And that comes from my background as a county councillor, where I had the children's services portfolio for some time. But now on to the Rachel Reeves affair. So just as a wrap up, just in case you looking at this in a few weeks after after the event, there's been a big clamour for Rachel Reeves to stand down after the budget, and the reason for that is because, by all accounts, there was some exaggeration went on about how bad our finances were as a way of justifying tax increases. And I suspect there's some merit in that. But I still don't think she should go. There's a couple of reasons. The first one is, when you look at the analysis of why they think she was overly pessimistic, and the mechanics of where that comes from, it's not simple. It's not just a straightforward fact that she was saying this and why. It's balancing X against Y versus Z. And I think all of the news channels did some coverage of it. I think Sky News probably did their best coverage of how the funding works out, and why they think she was deceitful. But it is really quite complicated, and I think you're stretching it a bit, especially. And this to me is probably the most important thing. If you look back the last 15, 20 years, almost every single budget we've had, certainly the budgets where we've been approaching general elections, we've been in a point where the Chancellor has exaggerated the state of our finances. As I said, in the run up to general elections, by and large, it's a way of justifying tax cuts. And you might say, yes, but this time it was to justify tax rises. You're right, and it was to justify tax cuts. But then, if a party was then re-elected after that, the budget afterwards, they'd raise taxes again. So this sort of tomfoolery has been happening for a long time. And yes, it is an indicator of the fact that our system isn't working, and that our politicians are not always straight with us in the way they manage it. And, from a personal perspective, the approach to me is to make it much, much more straightforward. We need to really simplify our taxation system so that we can understand it better, rather than be victims of the sort of whataboutery that we've had to suffer in the last few weeks, and in the last probably 10 budgets or so. The more we simplify it, the more we understand it. That's good for British politics. But it's also true that the more we simplify it, the less the system costs to run. So for me, I'm all in favour of I'm all in favour of simplifying the tax system, and let's start from there. But so there's that. But I also don't think it's in anybody's interest for Rachel Reeves to resign, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, what is the cause of it? If as a politician you are looking after the interests of this country, if Rachel Reeves resigns, you're just getting somebody else as a target, and that's it. And then you're putting a prime minister up as a target as well. And I've already talked about this. We need to stop this constant turnover and churn in prime ministers, where your prime ministers are basically having a life of, on average, 2 years. We need to change it. And, there's a reality that if Rachel Reeves goes, then Keir Starmer goes. But first of all, he's got to appoint another chancellor. And then what do we get? If Keir Starmer had to go, we'd get a new prime minister, and a new prime minister would have to appoint another chancellor. And that's true right across the whole of the government structure, by the way. There'd be ministers coming and going all over the place and swapping around and doing all sorts. And what we really could genuinely do with is a system where we've got some sort of stability. So from that perspective, I don't think it works. But let's say even if the consequences of it were a general election and a change in prime minister, who wants to become prime minister when they can look at what's happened before them, see that nothing has changed in terms of the way the media behave, the way politicians behave, and the way our government is currently working, and think, great, I'm going to be prime minister for 2 years? Because you're not, that's what the message is, that if you become prime minister, you've got an average life 2 years. Looks like Keir Starmer might actually exceed the average a little bit sometime soon. But, I'll just remind you, from 2016 to today, we've had 5 prime ministers. That's less than 10 years. We've had a prime minister. In less than 10 years, we've had a prime minister on average every 2 years. So, before that, I think it was 37 years before that, we also had 5 prime ministers. They were lasting on average 7 years. We need to go back to that. And all this messing around with the budget, I found was weird. And one of the things somebody said was it was even coming from within the cabinet. There's a couple of reports said that a cabinet member had said they felt deceived by Rachel Reeves's budget. Well, of course, we know that Keir Starmer's under a lot of pressure at the moment, and so we also know that there will be cabinet members and their friends on manoeuvres. So if a journalist wants a quote from a cabinet member that says something that suits their agenda to become the next prime minister, they've just got to ask and it'll happen. It's one of the flaws of our system. There are some systems abroad where a politician or their representative are not allowed to give anonymous briefings to journalists, and I think it's something we need to think about going forward. Because again, these sort of leaks, they do nothing but destabilize. They certainly don't help the country, and that's what politicians are supposed to be doing: is running the country, providing direction for the country, and at the moment, none of that is happening. So I don't think it's in anybody's interests to actually say, yeah, I'm going to be the next prime minister, so I'll take it. That right. I suspect Nigel Farage would, just because he'll take any chance he can get. And we can see from the news today, and by the fact that he said a few things about an alliance with the Conservatives, that he probably doesn't believe that he's going to be prime minister of a majority government, and so he would take it. But why, if you were Kemi Badenoch, would you take it? And I do think Kemi Badenoch is coming into her own as leader of the opposition at the moment, and certainly the pressure is not on her; it's on Keir Starmer, and I think she's performing really well. But I still don't see why, at this particular point, she would want to cause so much disruption that we get forced into another general election. It's not in her interest. Why not, instead of doing that, yes, maybe put put the challenge in that you're doing to government, a little more focus on what's happening and what's going wrong, and a little less focus on some of the little catcalling there was during the budget. But why not, while you're doing that stuff and holding the government to account, start talking about the political system being broken, start talking about the Conservatives being the party that was going to fix it, and start talking about some of the ideas around that. Because I think that if she did that, she would start dragging in a lot of the people from the centre ground, and certainly the old One Nationists from the Conservatives, like me, would be tempted to come along and at least vote for her at the next election, even though I may not be willing to join the party. Not unless I was absolutely convinced that we'd seen a proper return of One Nationism. But that language that needs to come from somebody in central government to say, we have got a fundamental breakdown in the way our system works. My number one priority as Prime Minister is going to be to restructure and revisit the way our politics is done, so that we've got a system that is delivering for Britain again. Surely that's the way to do it, not to try and oust Keir Starmer and, juggle something where, we end up with another general election, and we end up with another change in Prime Minister, and a Prime Minister who's going to have 2 years to live. So I hope that makes sense to you. It certainly is my view that we do not have enough politicians talking about the sort of change we need. And if you agree with me, or if you don't, but you like what I say, and you like the challenge, and you should like the challenge, if you like your politics, then please like and subscribe, and above all else, please share, because the only way people get to see these videos really is by getting to find out about them. And I hope you can cope with the background for now. I'll sometime or another I'll change it and put something sensible in. But I hope that makes sense to you. And thank you once again for taking a look at my channel. Thank you.